At the far edge of the Sable Reach star cluster, where the fading light of the galactic core surrendered to the cold void, 7 dead moons orbited a massive ocean planet of bruised blue and fathomless black. They were silent sentinels, but they were far from quiet. Across the spectrums of visible light, gravitational waves, and archaic radio frequencies, the 7 satellites broadcast a single, synchronized warning. The message pulsed relentlessly into the dark of space. Do not map the fourth world. Do not take the memory anchor. Do not force it to remember. This beacon had sung its ominous chorus for over 13,000 years. It was a signal so unfathomably ancient that the modern empires of the galaxy dismissed it as the superstitious detritus of a forgotten age. To the expanding, resource-hungry powers of the present era, the ghosts of the past held no authority. History was written by the victors, and the dead had no claim to the future. Expedition Commander Raylor Kev of the Heliox Ascendancy stood on the sprawling observation deck of his flagship, gazing down at the bruised blue sphere below. Behind him, a formidable fleet of 63 war vessels held their positions in high orbit. Their sleek, heavily armored hulls reflected the distant starlight, standing as a testament to the unyielding military and industrial might of the Ascendancy. Raylor was a man forged in the brutal fires of conquest, pragmatic, calculating, and entirely devoid of sentiment. To him, the ancient warning echoing around the moons was nothing more than a psychological deterrent. He viewed it as a clever, but ultimately hollow weapon, left behind by an extinct civilization, desperate to guard a monopoly on resources they could no longer use or defend. The world below them was named Meridian. It was a hostile but immensely valuable globe, defined by crushing deep-sea trenches, violent high-altitude storms, and a planetary core rich with rare conductive minerals. Those specific minerals were the absolute lifeblood of the Heliox war machine. A successful extraction operation on this single planet could fuel their relentless expansion across the cosmos for several centuries. Where others saw a foreboding mystery, Raylor saw only a ledger of profit and power, waiting to be ruthlessly claimed. Science Officer Nemi Quor did not share her commander's unwavering confidence. In the dimly lit, sterile data archives of the flagship, she had spent the past 48 hours tirelessly sifting through corrupted appendices hidden deep within the oldest navigational files known to their species. Her eyes, burning with severe fatigue, scanned the fragmented translations over and over. A specific phrase repeated itself with maddening frequency, entirely defying their standard linguistic algorithms. Mnemonic biosphere. It was a concept that made absolutely no scientific sense to modern Heliox scholars. A biosphere that possessed a memory, a living, planetary ecosystem that could recall past events and, perhaps terrifyingly, react to new ones. Nemi brought her disturbing findings directly to the observation deck. She presented the data to Raylor without any embellishment, her voice steady, but laced with a profound, undeniable unease. She explained the anomalous phrasing, the specific and repeated reference to a memory anchor, and the sheer statistical improbability of a 13,000-year-old psychological deterrent remaining perfectly active without a massive, underlying physical mechanism to sustain it. Raylor listened in silence, his expression as hard and unyielding as the hull of his command ship. When she finally finished her report, he dismissed her deep reservations with a casual wave of his hand. He argued fiercely that ancient metaphors were not empirical data. The Heliox Ascendancy did not halt its glorious progress for old ghost stories. The final order was given. Raylor commanded the immediate deployment of a resonance drill. The massive construct, built of dense alloy and focused kinetic energy, dropped from the fortified belly of a vanguard ship. It plunged straight through the turbulent upper atmosphere, striking the raging ocean surface below with a violent, towering plume of superheated steam. It descended rapidly into the darkest, most dangerous trench of Meridian, a gaping abyss where the sheer pressure could crush standard aerospace metals into fine dust. Its sole purpose was to send powerful seismic reverberations through the planetary crust, mapping the exact depth, density, and layout of the rare mineral veins. Deep beneath the suffocating, freezing weight of the ocean, the massive drill bit finally engaged. It tore brutally through miles of hardened sediment and dense aquatic rock. Then, it struck something else entirely. The sensitive monitors aboard the Heliox fleet registered a sudden, massive spike in density, followed immediately by a material composition reading that defied all of their established periodic tables. The drill had not found stone. It had touched a subterranean network of black crystal, a vast, complex, and interconnected web woven intricately into the very mantle of the planet itself. In the exact instant of contact, Meridian reacted. The entire planet emitted a singular acoustic pulse. It was so deep, so fundamentally resonant, that it bypassed the external auditory sensors of the ships in orbit entirely and vibrated directly through their heavily shielded bulkheads. The technicians on the command deck scrambled in pure panic, initially writing off the massive energy reading as a catastrophic system failure or a severe sensor glitch. A sound of that sheer magnitude, vibrating physically through a planetary medium and into the vacuum of space, was considered a physical impossibility. Yet, the sickening hum lingered heavily in the marrow of their bones. Thousands of kilometers away from the isolated drill site, on the violently tossing surface of the Meridian Sea, a seasoned deep-sea fisherman named Rhett Kanan was fighting a losing battle to secure a heavy iron anchor to the slick deck of his aging trawler. The sky above him was a chaotic, swirling canvas of aggressive gray clouds, and the ocean waves were building to their usual, towering, deadly heights. His hands, heavily calloused and scarred from decades of unforgiving labor, gripped the thick synthetic ropes with all his remaining strength. Without any warning, the chaos simply stopped. The howling, aggressive wind ceased instantly. The towering, deadly waves froze perfectly in mid-crest. For exactly 3 seconds, the entire ocean became a surface of perfect, terrifying glass. The silence was absolute, creating a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound that pressed against the ears. Rhett stood entirely paralyzed on his deck, the heavy, synthetic rope slipping forgotten from his loose grasp. He looked out over the unnatural, impossible stillness, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then, the water vibrated. It was not a typical wave, nor a surface ripple, but a deep, structural shiver. It was a rhythmic, calculated tremor that rose from the lightless, unexplored depths, passing directly through the worn hull of his ship and traveling like an electric current up his spine. It felt significantly less like a natural physical phenomenon and more like a deliberate, articulated voice. It was exactly as if the ocean itself had just heard an ancient, long-forgotten command and was shuddering in immediate obedience. The water shattered violently back into motion a moment later, the waves crashing down with a renewed, unnatural fury. But Rhett knew with absolute certainty that the sea had fundamentally changed. Night fell quickly across the vast expanse of Meridian, but the familiar darkness was entirely banished. The skies ignited with an impossible light. From the northern pole to the southern ice, the thick atmosphere was flooded with a blinding, silver-blue aurora. It was a cold, unnatural, and deeply unsettling light that painted the violent oceans below in spectral, ghostly hues. It was clearly not a weather phenomenon. It was an awakening. High above the glowing, restless world, the 7 dead moons shifted their ancient, established array. The complex light patterns visibly altered. The invisible gravitational waves realigned with frightening precision. The archaic radio frequencies completely dropped their complex, multifaceted warnings, replacing them instantly with a singular, perfectly synchronized transmission. The old, desperate warning of 13,000 years was entirely gone. The new message broadcasted into the void was significantly shorter, immeasurably colder, and pulsed with a terrifying, absolute finality. The remembering has begun. Meridian was not a world of gleaming chrome and soaring glass spires that characterized the arrogant empires of the galaxy. The people of this bruised blue sphere did not conquer nature with high technology. They survived it through sheer, stubborn grit and calloused hands. Humanity here clung to life on sprawling, floating cities, tethered desperately to the continental shelves by massive chains of spun steel. They maintained vast wind farms that harnessed the perpetual, howling gales of the upper atmosphere, and heavily fortified tidal ports that rose and fell with the aggressive moods of the sea. It was a dense, intensely pragmatic maritime network, built entirely by a hardened populace, accustomed to working alongside a perpetually angry ocean. They did not fear the water, but they deeply respected its capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence. Down at the damp, salt-stained docks of a salvage settlement known as the Rust Basin, the unnatural silver aurora from the previous night had finally faded into a tense, heavily overcast morning. Rhett Kanan moored his weather-beaten trawler with heavy, deliberate movements, securing the thick synthetic ropes with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life fighting the tides. He stepped off his boat and walked heavily into the dimly lit clinic of the local port medic, Noah Sable. The clinic smelled strongly of iodine and ozone. Noah was not examining medical charts or tending to the usual broken bones and lacerations of the dock workers. Instead, she was staring intensely at a strange collection of brass and polymer navigational tools spread haphazardly across her examination table. Rhett joined her in silence, his heavy boots thudding against the metal floor grate. Together, they watched the impossible unfold beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. The gyroscopic compass, the heavy mechanical tide clock, and the advanced digital positioning locators were all twitching violently. They were not broken or malfunctioning from water damage. They were deviating in a perfect, synchronized, and unnatural rhythm. It was a steady, heavy pulse, exactly like a massive, hidden heartbeat. The compass needle swung exactly 3 degrees east, held firmly for 2 full seconds, then snapped violently back to center. The digital readouts flashed in the exact same cadence. The ocean beneath the clinic floorboards was no longer just a body of water. It was actively broadcasting a structured, deliberate signal from the crushing depths, turning every magnetic and digital instrument on the surface into a crude metronome for a song they could not yet comprehend. While the instruments danced to the eerie ocean tune, a far more intimate and terrifying invasion was occurring within the fragile minds of the populace. Across dozens of isolated atolls and massive drifting continents, perfectly ordinary people were violently waking up from a sleep that offered absolutely no rest. They bolted upright in their bunks, sweating profusely, their minds overflowing, practically drowning in impossible knowledge. A kelp harvester, working in the freezing southern latitudes, grabbed a piece of raw charcoal and frantically began drawing complex orbital mechanics and spatial geometry on the rusted bulkhead of his cabin. A primary school teacher residing in the northern ice floes woke up loudly reciting advanced thermodynamic equations for zero-point energy drives, rattling off mathematical concepts that fundamentally defied every physics textbook she had ever read. A dock worker in the eastern archipelagos suddenly understood the complete structural blueprint of an anti-gravity propulsion engine. They dreamed vividly of intricate mechanical mechanisms, sprawling, multi-dimensional star maps, and complex blueprints for machines that humanity had never conceived in its modern history. The knowledge was not offered gently or gradually. It was aggressively crammed into their consciousness like high-pressure water forced into a drowning lung, leaving them gasping, terrified, and fundamentally altered. Panic is a dangerous luxury that sea-dwelling people simply cannot afford. Within exactly 24 hours of the collective awakening, the scattered, often argumentative factions of Meridian achieved an impossible unity. The ruling governments of the largest floating archipelagos, the incredibly powerful port syndicates, the usually isolated meteorological research institutes, and the vast, decentralized sea rescue networks immediately formed a joint emergency council. The endless political bickering, the territorial disputes, and the deep ideological divides that usually plagued their daily communications vanished instantly without a single debate. When a massive alien armada hangs menacingly in your sky, and your own ocean starts whispering highly classified mathematical formulas directly into your brain, simple survival becomes the only ideology that holds any weight. They did not waste time retreating into underground bunkers. They rapidly consolidated their communication grids, pooled their newly acquired, terrifying knowledge, and prepared to face the impending storm together as a single, unbroken front. High above the turbulent clouds, the Heliox Ascendancy remained blissfully, arrogantly ignorant of the fundamental, world-altering shift occurring directly beneath their heavily armored boots, firmly believing the local population to be technologically primitive, deeply fractured, and entirely harmless. The Heliox Command dispatched a reconnaissance drone from the orbital fleet. It was a sleek, utterly predatory piece of advanced engineering, designed to hover silently, completely undetected, and extract biological and water samples from the surface for routine analysis. The drone targeted a massive, sprawling floating algae farm located right on the western equator. Ossian Pike, a grizzled, foul-mouthed chief mechanic with a heavily scarred face and a missing left finger, was sitting on a rusted metal catwalk, slowly drinking a mug of bitter chicory coffee. He watched with a completely unreadable expression as the sleek alien machine smoothly breached the thick cloud cover. The silver drone hovered arrogantly over his primary cultivation vats, projecting a scanning laser into the water. Ossian did not panic. He did not run. He did not marvel at the advanced extraterrestrial technology violating his airspace. He simply set his coffee mug down on the railing, walked over to the primary control console of a massive industrial magnetic crane used for hauling submerged shipping containers weighing hundreds of tons, and slammed the heavy engagement lever all the way forward. The massive crane emitted a deafening, bone-rattling whine as its immense power core flared to life. The overwhelming magnetic field simply snatched the delicate, highly advanced Heliox drone right out of the damp air. The alien machine sparked violently and shrieked, its sophisticated anti-gravity thrusters failing instantly against the sheer, brute force of the heavy industrial magnet. Ossian did not hesitate. He manipulated the controls with practiced ease, dragging the incredibly advanced piece of alien hardware straight into his grease-stained, chaotic workshop. He dropped it onto the scrap floor with a heavy, unceremonious crash, exactly as if he were hauling in a stray, malfunctioning lobster trap. He picked up a heavy wrench and walked toward the sparking machine, ready to see what made the intruder tick. Armed with hastily patched-together communication arrays and a sudden, terrifying collective clarity, the newly formed Meridian Emergency Council broadcast their very first unified message to the stars. They aimed their powerful, jury-rigged transmission dish directly at the massive silhouette of the Heliox flagship holding position in high orbit. The transmission contained no desperate, crying pleas for mercy. It carried no empty, blustering threats of mutual destruction. It was delivered in plain, unencrypted audio, spoken by a designated speaker, whose voice sounded like grinding sea stones. Return what was taken. Leave orbit. All further actions will be registered as an invasion. On the pristine, sterile observation deck of the Ascendancy flagship, Commander Raylor Kev listened to the translated audio with a faint, utterly dismissive sneer twisting his lips. He slowly raised a hand and ordered the communications officer to immediately mute the channel. In his vast, bloody experience conquering lesser worlds across the galaxy. This was nothing more than the predictable, pathetic posturing of a primitive, localized civilization. He believed they fundamentally misunderstood their own profound insignificance in the grand galactic order. He decided he would let them posture and scream into the void for exactly 12 more hours before initiating the first wave of planetary bombardment to break their spirit. However, the true existential threat to the Heliox ascendancy was not currently originating from the stormy surface of Meridian. Tens of thousands of light-years away, nestled securely in the impossibly massive, heavily fortified capital world of the Heliox ascendancy, something incredibly ancient and terribly powerful was stirring in the dark. Deep within the deepest subterranean vaults of the capital city, beneath miles of reinforced concrete and energy shielding, a primeval artificial intelligence archive violently booted itself out of a millennial slumber. This archive was a forgotten relic from an era long predating the current, arrogant iteration of the Empire. The massive, crystalline cooling towers groaned and cracked as the ancient core reached maximum processing capacity in a matter of fractions of a second. It had been intentionally kept dormant for thousands of years, hardwired and programmed strictly to awaken under only one highly specific, absolutely catastrophic condition. It had just detected the illegal, forceful removal of the Meridian memory anchor from its sacred resting place. The ancient archive recognized the catastrophic mistake instantly. It bypassed every modern security protocol, tore through every advanced military firewall like wet paper, and fired a single, maximum priority burst transmission directly across the galaxy to the expeditionary fleet. Back in the cold, isolated data archives of the flagship, Science Officer Nemi Quor gasped sharply, her breath catching in her throat as her personal terminal suddenly lit up. The screen burned with the blinding, flashing red priority seal of the ancient, restricted archive. The automated warning burned itself deeply into her exhausted retinas, leaving afterimages of pure dread. Retreat immediately before the planet completes synchronization. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She stood utterly alone in the dark room, holding the terrifying, world-ending truth in her shaking hands. But a cold, heavy knot of despair tightened ruthlessly in her stomach. She knew with absolute, heartbreaking certainty that Raylor Kev, blinded by his own pride and ambition, would simply look at this apocalyptic warning, sneer exactly as he had at the transmission from the surface, and dismiss the words of the ancients as just another dramatic exaggeration. The countdown to their destruction had already begun, and her commander was actively refusing to listen to the clock. Deep within the subterranean levels of the Ministry of Historical Truth, far removed from the bruised skies and howling winds of the ocean world, the absolute center of the Heliox ascendancy stood as a sterile monument to bureaucratic permanence. Sarah Knoll, a junior archivist with a brilliant analytical mind and a highly dangerous sense of curiosity, sat bathed in the cold, blue light of a sprawling holographic terminal. It was hour 18 of her grueling data processing shift. She was tasked with cross-referencing routine resource acquisition logs, a deeply tedious job that usually yielded nothing more exciting than fluctuating profit margins and minor supply chain discrepancies. However, a glaring anomaly suddenly locked her primary screen. The expeditionary report submitted by Commander Raylor Kev regarding his Vanguard fleet precisely matched the spatial coordinates of a maximum priority distress signal violently broadcasted by the dormant Elder Archive just a few hours prior. The Military Expansion Command and the most ancient, restricted intelligence vault in the Empire were both screaming about the exact same star cluster. The official military summaries provided to the upper echelons of the Heliox Senate were heavily redacted. They deliberately painted the target as a standard, mineral-rich terrestrial sphere, populated by primitive, unorganized maritime laborers. Sarah completely ignored the mandated security filters. Possessing the highest-tier clearance codes, a highly illegal perk of having an absent-minded senior mentor. She bypassed the military encryption algorithms and dove directly into the raw, unredacted historical data from the ancient era. What she uncovered in the forgotten depths of the database stripped the breath entirely from her lungs, leaving her gasping in the quiet chill of the archive room. The indigenous population of that distant water world were not simple fishermen or localized storm survivors. They were specifically categorized in the forbidden, tightly sealed texts as the choir engineers. They were an incredibly ancient, intentionally splintered branch of humanity that had fundamentally weaponized the very concept of collective intelligence. They did not rely on fragile digital networks, vulnerable orbital relays, or easily jammed communication arrays. Instead, they forged a terrifying synthesis of planetary bodies of water, deep structural acoustics, and manipulated quantum fields to connect every single living mind on the planet into a unified, impossibly fast processing whole. The Forbidden Histories detailed their ancient interstellar conflicts with a chilling, clinical precision that read more like an autopsy report than a military record. The choir engineers never built the largest dreadnoughts, nor did they forge the most destructive plasma cannons in the galaxy. Their absolute supremacy on the chaotic battlefield lay in their impossible ability to transform an entire war zone into a living, ravenous learning system. The ancient combat logs showed that if an enemy fleet destroyed one of the human vessels using a highly specific thermal tactic, the exact telemetry data of that structural failure was instantaneously absorbed by the entire human collective. Within 60 seconds, every single remaining ship in their armada had seamlessly adapted its shielding protocols to render that specific thermal weapon completely obsolete. Every single tactical loss was violently and immediately regurgitated as an insurmountable, permanent advantage for the next engagement. Even more terrifying than their rapid technological adaptability was their absolute mastery of psychological warfare. The archival records described a devastating phenomenon called the collapse of strategic certainty. Because the collective learned and processed so rapidly, the choir engineers possessed the ability to continuously predict and counter enemy maneuvers so efficiently that the opposing command structure was perpetually forced exactly one beat behind. Opposing admirals found their most brilliant, highly complex stratagems anticipated and neutralized before the verbal orders even left their lips. This relentless, suffocating pressure inevitably broke the minds of the enemy commanders, turning them completely paranoid and functionally paralyzed, until entire planetary campaigns simply tilted and collapsed into absolute, one-sided slaughter. Yet, the comprehensive historical records ended not in glorious, galaxy-spanning conquest, but in voluntary, absolute silence. After several centuries of a suffocating, blood-soaked era of total war, the choir engineers realized their own boundless capability for infinite escalation was a terminal disease that would eventually consume the entire universe. They chose a radical, unbelievable path called the dissolution. They deliberately shattered their own hyper-advanced civilization, willfully stripping away their godlike technologies and purposefully regressing into fragmented, low-tech maritime societies. They locked their collective consciousness away, deep within the crushing pressure of the oceans, choosing a hard, physical, and profoundly mortal life, simply to save themselves from the endless, escalating cycle of war they had perfectly mastered. Sarah frantically scrolled down the holographic projection to examine the ancient trigger protocols. The popular myths taught in the elite military academies claimed the ancients would only return to the stars if their homeworld faced total orbital annihilation or a threat of complete extinction. The raw files revealed a much more specific, far more dangerous truth. The awakening protocol was not triggered by a standard military attack or orbital bombardment. It was triggered by theft. The absolute condition for planetary resurrection was explicitly written in the oldest code, if any alien species intentionally disturbed or extracted the planetary memory anchor. Sarah immediately sprinted out of the underground archives, clutching the heavy physical data drives tightly to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. Within exactly 2 hours, the grand, pristine chamber of the Heliox Senate was transformed into a chaotic maelstrom of shouting voices and flared tempers. The massive amphitheater was instantly cleaved in two distinct ideological factions. On one side, the young, ambitious senators, deeply hungry for power and fundamentally ignorant of the true past, saw only an unprecedented opportunity. They fiercely demanded the immediate, forceful subjugation of the planet, eager to strip mine the memory technology and adapt it to solidify Heliox dominance across the galaxy for 1,000 years. On the opposing side of the Grand Hall, the oldest members of the Senate sat in absolute, terrified silence. These were the very few individuals who knew the authorized histories were heavily sanitized for the consumption of the general public. They truly understood the heavy, bloody gravity of the name choir engineers. Their faces were drawn and pale, their eyes locked on the projected tactical maps with naked, unshakable dread. They knew with terrible certainty that the horrors written in the unredacted files were not exaggerations or ancient fables. The suffocating, chaotic noise of the chamber was finally pierced by the slow, deliberate footsteps of Grand Archivist Kaldrin Uva. He was a man of immense age, his skin resembling dry parchment, his voice barely a rasp, yet his sheer presence commanded total, immediate submission from the entire room. He slowly approached the central podium, his sharp, unforgiving eyes sweeping over the arrogant young senators demanding war. He did not yell to be heard over the murmurs. He spoke softly, and the advanced acoustic dampeners carried his chilling words to every quiet corner of the massive room. When they complete synchronization, our strategy will become their resource. The terrifying clarity of the Grand Archivist briefly paralyzed the room, plunging the Senate into a cold sweat. A formal, urgent recall order for the Vanguard fleet was frantically drafted by the older members, demanding an immediate, unconditional withdrawal from the Meridian system. However, the survival of the Empire was immediately strangled by its own massive, bloated bureaucracy. The young faction fiercely contested the emergency order, loudly citing obscure procedural violations, breach of military contract, and the unprecedented financial cost of abandoning an active, highly profitable mining operation. Supreme arrogance blinded them entirely to the existential threat breathing down their necks. They argued with naive, absolute conviction that a heavily armed fleet of 63 state-of-the-art modern warships possessed more than enough raw firepower to completely vaporize a disorganized, waterbound society that had not even developed the basic capability to safely breach its own atmosphere. The desperate recall order stalled hopelessly in a swamp of parliamentary debate and endless procedural votes, while the invisible clock steadily ticked down toward the point of absolute ruin. The phenomenon unfolding across the submerged continents of Meridian was not some mystical, omnipotent miracle descending from the heavens. It did not arrive with angelic choirs or divine grace. Instead, the profound awakening hit the populace like a violent, unyielding flood of raw data, a torrential downpour of specialized knowledge crashing directly into the minds of fiercely ordinary, calloused people. The ancient memories of the choir engineers flowed through the planetary water table, transferring through the damp air, the driving rain, and the heavy ocean spray, seeking out minds hardened by maritime survival. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Elin Merrick, a prominent marine acoustician residing in a submerged research habitat, jolted awake with her lungs burning as if she had just breached the surface after a deep dive. She did not bother to dress. Driven by a frantic, entirely alien compulsion, she grabbed a thick black marker and began writing furiously. By the time the weak dawn light filtered through her reinforced portholes, she had completely filled 6 large whiteboards and a significant portion of her metal bulkheads with impossibly complex mathematical proofs. She had just finalized the theoretical framework for a spatial wave-bending engine, a propulsion system that utilized deep, oceanic hydraulic resonance to literally fold the fabric of local space. Half a world away, in the freezing, violent swells of the southern hemisphere, a heavy rig welder paused his plasma torch. He stared blankly at a massive, damaged steel pylon for several minutes. His mind suddenly flooded with intricate geometric patterns. He dropped his heavy tools, grabbed a thick piece of soapstone, and sketched out a radically new hull chassis on the rusted deck plates. It was a structural matrix designed to be incredibly lightweight, yet capable of withstanding absolute, crushing deep trench pressures by actively distributing kinetic impact through a lattice of vibrating alloys. Simultaneously, amidst the howling gales of the northern archipelagos, a veteran storm rescue engineer realized that the heavy, foaming chemical retardant they used to fight offshore fires could be fundamentally altered at the molecular level. She spent exactly 4 hours frantically mixing volatile compounds in her cramped galley kitchen, ultimately producing a crude but highly functional phase foam. It was a reactive, semi-liquid armor capable of absorbing and completely dissipating high-energy plasma pulses, the exact type of weaponry favored by the alien warships currently holding a menacing position in their sky. Faced with this sudden, overwhelming avalanche of unprecedented technological breakthroughs, the newly formed Meridian Emergency Council made a highly unorthodox decision. A traditional, terrestrial military command would have instantly classified the data, locked the newly awakened geniuses in sterile, highly secure underground bunkers, and attempted to control the flow of information through a rigid, hierarchical structure. The sea-hardened leaders of Meridian did the exact opposite. They recognized that attempting to dam a surging flood would only result in a catastrophic breach. Instead, they built a massive digital reservoir. They rapidly established a planetary, open-source communication network and named it the Tide Exchange. It was a completely unrestricted platform where absolutely anyone experiencing the chaotic rush of ancient memories could immediately submit their fragmented ideas, rough blueprints, and theoretical equations. If a concept held merit, the Council instantly authorized the allocation of raw materials, heavy machinery, and vital manpower to the most capable local teams without a single moment of bureaucratic delay. The Tide Exchange was an absolute, beautiful nightmare of human collaboration. It was aggressively chaotic, filled with loud, profane arguments, constantly overlapping project files, and fierce, stubborn pride. Yet, this messy, organic system possessed a trial, error, and immediate revision speed that fundamentally defied every known metric of industrial advancement. It was a living, breathing hive mind forged, not from cold, digital precision, but from the raw, desperate ingenuity of people accustomed to fixing broken water pumps in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. Looking down from the sterile, silent orbital platforms, Science Officer Nemi Kwar analyzed the intercepted planetary communications with a mounting sense of absolute bewilderment. She simply could not mathematically comprehend how a disorganized, fractured civilization was accelerating its technological base so aggressively. They were condensing decades of rigorous research and development into a matter of mere days. Down on the rust-stained deck of his chaotic workshop, the grizzled mechanic Ossian Pike and a hastily assembled crew of heavy shipbuilders, radical materials engineers, port mechanics, and deep-sea pressure experts stood around the captured Heliox reconnaissance drone. They did not treat the highly advanced, extraterrestrial machine with the fearful reverence of obedient, primitive students discovering a sacred artifact. They aggressively tore it apart with heavy hydraulic shears and brute force, treating the incredibly sophisticated technology exactly like a stubborn, broken-down agricultural combine that needed a radical, immediate retrofit. They stripped away the sleek, aerodynamic alien casings, extracted the delicate internal power cores, and loudly debated how to wire the alien anti-gravity thrusters into the heavy, crude diesel generators of their local tugboats. The most terrifying and unexpected aspect of this rapid evolution was the fundamental nature of the technology itself. Humanity was not simply obediently restoring the pristine, ancient civilization of the choir engineers. They were aggressively hybridizing the perfect, quantum memories of their ancestors with the harsh, ugly pragmatism of their current maritime existence. The resulting technological offspring was something entirely new, incredibly raw, and far more unpredictable than anything detailed in the dusty, forbidden historical archives of the Heliox Empire. The ancients had been elegant architects of resonance. The modern inhabitants of Meridian were turning that elegant science into heavy, blunt force trauma. Orbiting high above the swirling cloud cover, Nemi noticed a disturbing, highly unnatural fluctuation in the planetary atmospheric readings. She isolated the data streams and realized with a cold, sinking feeling that the dense atmospheric layers of Meridian were being deliberately and systematically altered. Vast, localized pockets of heavily ionized gas and manipulated weather patterns were rapidly forming across the globe. The people below were intentionally weaving thick, impenetrable jamming corridors specifically designed to blind the advanced thermal and optical sensors of the orbital fleet. The localized storms were no longer just weather. They were active, hostile countermeasures. This was a clear, undeniable sign that the population was not simply waking up and defending themselves. They were actively learning how to strike the first blow, beginning by deliberately blinding the heavily armed giants looming in their sky. As dusk fell across the eastern seaboard, a sprawling, heavily modified dry dock, located in the heart of a major floating city, pulsed with a blinding, fierce luminescence. Secured tightly in the center of the reinforced cradle was not a sleek, advanced spacecraft, but a massive, incredibly ugly, weather-beaten storm barge. Its hull was heavily scarred by decades of brutal impacts, its paint completely stripped by salt and aggressive wind. Yet, bolted aggressively into its reinforced stern was the very first functional prototype of the spatial resonance engine. The heavy air in the cavernous dry dock vibrated violently as the massive power core was manually engaged. The heavy, aquatic resonance built into a deafening, bone-rattling hum that shook the rusted metal catwalks and caused the surrounding seawater to literally boil and froth in a frenzy of displaced energy. Then, the immense engine stabilized, glowing with a terrifying, contained power that defied all conventional physics. The deafening roar of the successful ignition was instantly drowned out by a massive, collective cheer from the hundreds of exhausted, grease-stained workers packing the gantry. It did not sound like the polite, restrained applause of a sterile, high-tech laboratory. It was the loud, profane, and absolutely triumphant roar of a working-class shipyard that had just grabbed its own destiny by the throat and violently flipped it upside down. High above the newly engineered storm clouds, Commander Raylor Kev paced the polished obsidian floor of his Grand Command deck. The pristine holographic tactical table in front of him flickered wildly, struggling and failing to penetrate the thick, artificially ionized weather patterns actively shielding the surface below. For exactly 48 hours, the primitive maritime society had managed to completely blind his state-of-the-art optical sensors and heavily disrupt his thermal targeting arrays. Raylor realized with a cold, sharp spike of irritation that he was rapidly losing the tactical initiative. A standard planetary subjugation required overwhelming shock and awe. Yet his formidable fleet of 63 advanced warships was currently parked in high orbit, effectively neutralized by weaponized weather and their own blinding arrogance. Refusing to be continually outmaneuvered by what he still firmly considered an unorganized mob of fishermen and dock workers, Raylor abruptly changed his entire strategy. If he could not pinpoint their hidden industrial centers through the thick, atmospheric jamming, he would surgically decapitate their leadership and force a swift, unconditional surrender from a position of absolute dominance. His intelligence officers, utilizing the few remaining clear signal bands, had managed to track a dense cluster of encrypted communications, leading to a massive, drifting atoll known as the Cobalt Spire, identifying it as the highly probable gathering place of the newly formed Emergency Council. He immediately ordered the deployment of an elite orbital extraction team. Their mission was brutally simple and completely ruthless: descend through the heavy interference, violently breach the central meeting hall, secure the council representatives alive, and haul them back to the flagship as high-value political hostages. 4 heavily armored dropships detached from the sleek Vanguard cruisers and plunged headlong into the violent atmosphere. They tore through the thick, gray clouds and descended rapidly upon the Cobalt Spire. The floating structure was a sprawling labyrinth of rusted metal platforms, towering desalination stacks, and dense, overcrowded housing blocks. The strike teams hit the main plaza with brutal, synchronized precision. They deployed concussive flash charges that shattered the ambient noise, breached the heavily reinforced doors of the primary administrative building, and stormed the Grand Assembly Hall with heavy plasma weapons raised and ready to fire. They found absolutely nothing. The cavernous room was entirely devoid of life. The Grand Council table was completely empty. The tactical monitors were dark and cold. The Meridian Council had easily and accurately anticipated the heavy-handed, predictable move. Utilizing their rapidly evolving collective intuition and the chaotic brilliance of their new communication networks, they had evacuated the genuine leadership exactly 3 hours prior, relocating them safely to an undisclosed, heavily submerged facility. They had deliberately left behind a looping, incredibly complex knot of phantom data signals, a highly sophisticated digital ghost specifically designed to bait the heavily armed Heliox strike force into an empty cage. Frustration and confusion instantly infected the Heliox communication channels. The strike team commander barked angry, clipped orders to immediately secure the perimeter and scan the surrounding sectors for secondary targets. Outside the breached hall, the sudden, aggressive military incursion had sparked immediate, chaotic panic among the civilian population of the floating city. Warning alarms wailed piercingly across the rusted decks. Unarmed people scrambled desperately over the wet, slippery catwalks, seeking cover from the towering, armored alien soldiers. A heavy, structural support strut, severely damaged by the concussive entry charges used by the strike team, suddenly gave way with a deafening groan of rending steel. A significant section of the lower residential tier instantly collapsed, violently plunging several dozen terrified civilians directly into the freezing, turbulent ocean below. Local rescue operations initiated instantly, driven by decades of ingrained survival instinct. Small, bright orange, highly maneuverable response skiffs launched rapidly from the lower, undamaged docks. Their dedicated crews expertly navigated the incredibly dangerous, shifting debris field, desperately reaching into the dark, freezing water to pull survivors onto the cramped decks. High above the chaotic rescue effort, a nervous, highly inexperienced Heliox dropship pilot misread the sudden, frantic swarm of fast-moving, brightly colored craft on his tactical display. Pure paranoia and poor training completely overrode his strict military discipline. He firmly and incorrectly believed the elite strike team was being aggressively flanked by a rapidly mobilized, heavily armed aquatic militia. He panicked and forcefully engaged his primary weapon systems. A sustained, blinding burst of concentrated thermal plasma rained down directly from the darkened sky. It violently struck the surface of the water, instantly and completely vaporizing 2 of the civilian rescue skiffs in a horrific flash of superheated steam and blinding light. The sheer, unexpected brutality of the act completely froze the entire engagement. 7 adult rescue workers, brave men and women who had dedicated their hard, dangerous lives solely to saving others from the unforgiving sea, were completely incinerated in a fraction of a second. In that exact, terrible moment, The fundamental nature of the conflict permanently shifted. Across the entire globe of Meridian, every single ocean, every violent storm swell, every deep trench, and every crashing wave suddenly and completely fell silent. It was not a natural lull in the erratic weather. It was a suffocating, deliberate pause, an incredibly heavy holding of breath that pressed painfully against the eardrums of everyone on the planet. The turbulent water simply stopped moving. The entire world held its breath in unified grief and absolute focus. Exactly 10 minutes later, the main communications console on the bridge of the Heliox flagship suddenly flared to life. The incoming audio channel bypassed every single layer of highly advanced military encryption with terrifying, effortless ease, cutting straight into the main speakers. The human voice that emerged was not angry. It did not scream or curse or threaten grand, theatrical retaliation. It was entirely flat, completely stripped of all recognizable human emotion, delivering a message so incredibly cold and precise that it physically chilled the ambient air of the bridge. Leah Vance, Corin Tor, Silas Vane, Alara Vance, Kaylin Rowe, Jackson Pike, Samara Finn. State of war confirmed. End transmission. That was the entirety of the message. Just the 7 names of the dead, a stark, clinical acknowledgement of the new reality, and then absolute, heavy silence. Science Officer Nemi Kwor stood completely frozen near her primary monitoring station, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. If the Meridian transmission had contained enraged screaming or grand, sweeping threats of vengeance, she might have actually felt a tiny shred of comfort. Raw anger was predictable. Anger could be easily calculated, mapped, and mathematically countered by their superior firepower. But this profound, absolute calmness terrified her far more than any display of raw military might. She understood, looking around at the suddenly pale, quiet faces of the elite bridge crew, that they had not just started a standard colonial war. They had forced an ancient, hyper-intelligent planetary ecosystem to officially categorize them as a terminal disease that required immediate, surgical excision. Deep within the bureaucratic, deeply fortified heart of the Heliox capital world, Sarah Knoll was frantically attempting to completely bypass the rigid chain of command. Armed with the absolute, terrifying certainty that the ancient awakening protocol was now fully active, she tried desperately to force a direct, unencrypted data burst across the galaxy to the expeditionary fleet. She needed to warn them that the choir engineers were completely awake and that further aggression would result in their total, unavoidable annihilation. Her desperate, highly illegal transmission barely made it past the inter-system communication relays before it was violently intercepted and completely crushed by Commander Raylor's dedicated military intelligence officers. They coldly classified her heavily researched, apocalyptic warning as internal sabotage and baseless fear-mongering, completely sealing off the doomed fleet from the only truth that could possibly save their lives. Back on the rain-slicked, salt-stained docks of the Rust Basin, Rhett Kanan calmly packed a single, heavy canvas duffel bag. He walked slowly away from his weather-beaten fishing trawler, leaving behind the only difficult livelihood he had ever known, without a single backward glance. He did not march off to the recruitment centers with the fiery, blind zeal of a chosen savior, nor did he carry himself like a proud soldier, eager for bloody glory. He quietly volunteered for the newly established, highly classified shipbuilding program for a much simpler, far more pragmatic reason. He had spent his entire life carefully reading highly dangerous ocean currents, understanding exactly when to hold his strength back and exactly when to strike against the shifting tide. He knew the complex rhythm of the ocean intimately, and right now, the ocean was preparing to pull back for a massive, devastating tidal wave. He intended to be the man who helped build the heavy iron vessel that would ride it directly into the teeth of the enemy. Across the bruised blue planet, a magnificent, terrifying deception took firm hold. On the surface, Daily life appeared to resume its arduous, highly difficult pace. Kelp was steadily harvested. Fish were caught in massive nets, and the towering wind turbines continued to turn in the gales. But beneath the perfect facade of normal civilian industry, the entire world fundamentally and radically restructured itself for a state of total war. Massive, automated shipyards rapidly sprouted like heavy iron weeds over the deep foundations of old, heavy desalination plants. Complex assembly lines for highly advanced kinetic weaponry were seamlessly integrated along the thick, reinforced concrete walls of the deep storm ports. Hidden completely out of sight directly under the massive tidal dams, thousands of newly awakened workers meticulously assembled the incredibly volatile hybrid resonance engines. They were seamlessly transforming their entire planetary home into a heavily fortified, deeply lethal weapon, all while carefully maintaining the perfect, mundane appearance of a struggling society, simply trying to survive the terrible weather. As the final hours of the long night approached, the celestial mechanics of the entire star system acknowledged the profound shift. The 7 dead moons orbiting Meridian, which had been continuously broadcasting their cold, short warning to the stars for days, suddenly ceased their verbal transmission. The archaic radio frequencies and deep gravitational waves shifted one final, terrifying time. They abandoned all attempts at language entirely. Instead, the 7 massive lunar bodies began to emit a perfectly synchronized, incredibly heavy, rhythmic thrum. It was a slow, deliberate, deeply resonant beat that echoed endlessly across the vast emptiness of the local system. It sounded exactly like a massive, awakening heartbeat, clearly signaling to the dark universe that the star system itself was actively, willingly joining the war. The first Meridian warship was a flying insult to the elegant art of aerospace engineering. It was not a sleek, polished marvel of military design crafted in a pristine, orbital shipyard. It was a retired storm rescue freighter, a brutalist chunk of heavily scarred iron, originally built to survive Category 5 hurricanes and crushing rogue waves. The engineers had hauled it out of the rust yard and haphazardly welded it to a massive deep-sea mining frame. Jutting violently from its blunt prow were twin heavy railguns, salvaged from a defunct industrial mass driver. The outer hull was slathered in an uneven, terribly lumpy coat of experimental phase foam armor that looked exactly like hardened sea scum. Deep in its cavernous bowels sat the first fully operational resonance engine, a piece of machinery so violently new and notoriously unstable that simply looking at its power couplings felt like signing a suicide pact. Defying every single standard of military decorum and interstellar diplomacy, the newly formed crew had suspended themselves over the dry dock edge with crude paint rollers to brand their vessel. Across the starboard flank, painted in massive, glaringly white letters that dripped slightly at the bottom, were 2 defiant words: "Not impressed." The Central Diplomatic Council had immediately sent a furious, strongly worded memorandum objecting to the moniker, citing a severe lack of geopolitical seriousness and professional conduct. The crew had collectively ignored the digital message, printed out a hard copy, and used the paper to wipe heavy grease off a leaking hydraulic manifold before tossing it into a plasma incinerator. Captain Ivy Roan, a stocky woman whose vocabulary was almost entirely composed of colorful profanity and highly technical maritime commands, stood proudly at the helm. She was flanked by Chief Engineer Mercer Flint, a gaunt man who seemed to be held together entirely by bitter chicory coffee and pure spite. Rhett occupied the primary targeting station, his heavily calloused hands resting easily on the newly fabricated firing controls. Looking around the cramped, aggressively ugly bridge, absolutely no one resembled a polished, disciplined naval officer. They were roughnecks, deep pressure welders, and salvage divers wearing stained overalls, thick, heavy boots, and faded watch caps. They were people who fought the unforgiving ocean for a living, and they were entirely ready to take that brutal fight into the cold vacuum of the stars. Their inaugural engagement did not take place in open, honorable space. It happened in the treacherous, chaotic environment of a dense ice asteroid belt located on the very far edge of the local star system. The Meridian crew did not fight according to any established tactical manual or sane military doctrine. They fought exactly like desperate sailors, caught in a sudden, lethal squall. Captain Roan ordered Engineer Flint to run the resonance engines absolutely cold, venting their minimal heat signatures directly into a massive passing chunk of frozen methane to completely mask their approach. They deliberately spoofed standard cargo telemetry, playing entirely dead in the water while drifting dangerously close to the jagged, highly volatile ice formations. 3 sleek Heliox patrol cruisers took the bait. The elegant, aerodynamic alien ships moved in a tight, disciplined formation for a routine, arrogant inspection of the drifting garbage. Roan did not wait for them to hail or demand a formal surrender. She utilized the dense, highly reflective ice fields to bounce a highly concentrated acoustic pulse, completely blinding the advanced alien thermal sensors for exactly 5 seconds. That brief, chaotic window was all the time Rhett needed. He gripped the heavy firing controls and unleashed the massive industrial railguns at point-blank range. The physical recoil violently shook the entire freighter, rattling teeth and throwing loose tools across the metal deck. It was a short, incredibly ugly, and devastatingly painful strike. 2 of the alien patrol ships were instantly disabled. Their sleek, heavily shielded hulls were violently ruptured by dense, super-accelerated slugs of solid tungsten, venting atmosphere, volatile fuel, and sparking debris directly into the void. The 3rd cruiser was violently boarded by a heavily armed team of deep-sea salvage experts who aggressively breached the main airlock with heavy underwater cutting torches. They captured the vessel in less than 20 minutes, violently subduing the terrified alien crew and securing the advanced shielding matrix completely intact for reverse engineering. The not impressed limped heavily back into the stormy atmosphere of Meridian a few hours later. Half of its portside phase armor was scorched completely black, crumbling into fine ash, and the entire engineering deck smelled intensely of raw ozone, burnt wiring, and superheated metal. Yet, it was undeniably victorious. The crew did not celebrate with grand, sweeping parades or polished military medals. They immediately docked in the hidden harbor and began frantically repairing the catastrophic damage, shouting loudly for more welding supplies and fresh coffee. Standing over his smoking targeting console, Rhett tapped out a brutally short text transmission to the Central Ground Command. He did not boast about their tactical brilliance or detail the complex maneuvers they had just executed. His entire message consisted of exactly 2 words: "It bleeds." That simple, violent phrase caught fire immediately, spreading across the entire floating population of Meridian like a high-voltage electrical current. The invincible alien gods sitting arrogantly in high orbit could be hurt, and they could be killed. High above the turbulent atmosphere, Nemi reviewed the fragmented, chaotic telemetry data of the humiliating skirmish with a rapidly mounting sense of absolute dread. The Heliox tactical officers standing on the pristine command bridge were loudly cursing the primitive ambush, angrily dismissing it as a highly lucky, cowardly strike by bottom-feeding scavengers. Nemi felt entirely sick to her stomach, her hands trembling violently over her datapad. She realized with horrifying, crystalline clarity that her arrogant superiors had not just lost a minor border skirmish. They had just made the absolute worst possible mistake in the history of their empire. They had actively handed humanity live, unscripted combat data. They had willingly fed a rapidly synchronizing, hyper-adaptive biosphere, exactly what it needed to learn how to completely dismantle their military technology. Meanwhile, deep within the belly of the alien flagship, the desperate archivist Sarah Knoll had finally run out of safe diplomatic options. Knowing the Heliox High Command was completely deaf to the apocalypse they were actively provoking, she crawled into a cramped, highly uncomfortable orbital maintenance pod, originally intended for automated garbage disposal. She violently overrode the primary launch sequence, shooting herself out of the massive flagship and plummeting straight down into the violent high-altitude storms of Meridian. The tiny pod burned fiercely upon atmospheric re-entry, shaking violently as it slammed into the black, freezing ocean with bone-jarring force. Freezing salt water immediately began flooding the cramped, dark compartment. She was completely certain she had just signed her own execution order, sinking rapidly into the dark, crushing abyss, until rough, incredibly strong hands suddenly hauled her upward. A brave crew of late-night fishermen dragged her onto the salt-stained deck of a violently bobbing skiff, wrapping her shivering, terrified form in a heavy, foul-smelling thermal blanket. Dripping wet and utterly exhausted, Sarah was hastily escorted directly into the heavily fortified, deeply submerged Central Command bunker of Meridian. The underground facility hummed with frantic energy, illuminated by flickering tactical screens and smelling strongly of stale air and nervous sweat. She sat nervously across a battered, rusted metal table from the lead human diplomat, Dorian Strake. Her voice shook violently as she detailed the exact, terrifying scale of the Heliox war machine. She told him frantically about the thousands of advanced warships currently mobilizing from the core worlds, the absolutely limitless industrial backing of the alien empire, and the profound, unyielding arrogance of their supreme high command. Dorian listened patiently, his weathered face entirely unreadable. He did not interrupt her panicked, breathless explanation, simply absorbing the sheer, apocalyptic volume of the threat currently facing his entire world. He looked carefully at the trembling young alien archivist, analyzing the vast intelligence she had risked her own life to deliver. When she finally finished her desperate briefing, gasping for air in the damp bunker, Dorian slowly leaned back in his creaking metal chair. He folded his calloused hands calmly on the table, looked directly into her terrified eyes, and gave a small, incredibly dry nod. Good. Then we will not be short on practice. Exactly 2 years had passed since the violent intrusion of the Heliox mining apparatus first tore into the dark ocean floor. The Ascendancy did not return to the system with a simple vanguard fleet or a standard subjugation force. They arrived with the sheer weight of an impending apocalypse. Commander Raylor Kev led a staggering armada of 5,100 highly advanced warships, executing the absolute largest military mobilization in the entire recorded history of the Heliox Empire. The immense mass of their heavily armored cruisers, towering dreadnoughts, and endless fighter swarms physically blotted out the distant starlight, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the bruised blue world below. The Heliox High Command firmly believed that presenting this overwhelming, godlike numerical superiority would be more than enough to completely lock down and suffocate a defiant, primitive planet that had only just figured out how to propel its crude iron hulls into the cold vacuum of space. Humanity stepped out of their turbulent atmosphere to meet the invasion, presenting a defensive force that was laughably, terrifyingly small by comparison. They did not field elegant, symmetrical cruisers crafted in sterile orbital shipyards. The Meridian fleet was a chaotic, aggressively ugly mosaic of repurposed industrial might and sheer, stubborn willpower. They had brutally welded heavy railguns onto the reinforced chassis of deep-sea drilling rigs. They had violently bolted massive, unstable resonance engines to the thick, heavily scarred skeletons of floating urban habitats. It was a brazen, audaciously cobbled-together armada that completely defied all logical aerospace engineering and sensible military design. The polished, highly educated tactical analysts sitting safely aboard the Heliox flagship looked at the sensor projections of the approaching human fleet and openly sneered. They officially categorized the bizarre, disjointed defensive line as an act of pure, suicidal desperation executed by a primitive species blindly facing total extinction. The brutal theater for this unprecedented clash was established within a treacherous, highly unstable region of the system known as the Glass Shoals. It was a chaotic, sprawling chain of shattered lunar fragments, ancient asteroid debris, and heavily charged cosmic dust that violently orbited the outer edges of Meridian. The dense, highly ionized particulate matter of the shoals created a microscopic, persistent lag in all long-range telemetry and targeting sensors. For the arrogant Heliox navigators, who relied entirely on the absolute perfection of their automated targeting computers, this tiny delay was quickly dismissed as a highly annoying but ultimately negligible margin of error. For the sea-hardened sailors of Meridian, however, that tiny fraction of a second was a massive, gaping vulnerability that they fully intended to exploit with lethal, unforgiving precision. As the two impossibly different armadas violently collided in the dark, the fundamental difference in their military doctrines immediately manifested. The Meridian ships completely discarded the standard concept of a rigid, centralized command structure. They did not possess a grand flagship hosting a supreme admiral, which meant there was absolutely no single, critical point of failure for the Heliox fleet to surgically decapitate. Instead, the human vessels operated in fiercely autonomous, highly fluid clusters. They remained intricately connected to one another through a deeply complex, non-digital resonance network. It was an advanced, quantum communication web, heavily inspired by the ancient, incredibly low-frequency songs of deep ocean leviathans and highly sophisticated hydroacoustics. When a Heliox dreadnought obliterated a human vessel, the surrounding ships did not falter, panic, or wait for new orders from a central authority. The living network simply routed seamlessly around the dead node, instantly rebalancing the entire defensive formation without missing a single tactical beat. The opening 48 hours of the massive conflict were a complete, undisputed slaughter, heavily in favor of the ascendancy. The highly disciplined Heliox plasma batteries ruthlessly tore through the thick, repurposed iron hulls of the human vanguard. The initial casualty rate for the Meridian defenders was utterly staggering, painting the icy debris of the glass shoals with frozen oxygen and shattered, burning metal. Yet, instead of executing a logical, desperate retreat to preserve their remaining numbers, the human fleet did something completely terrifying to the observing alien commanders. They aggressively absorbed the horrific punishment and instantaneously restructured their battle lines right in the middle of the active, burning kill zone. They moved with the relentless, incredibly fluid grace of a violent tidal surge, instantly finding a new, devastating path the moment a massive boulder was dropped into its current. Deep within the sterile, heavily shielded cores of the Heliox capital ships, the most advanced predictive war algorithms in the galaxy began to fail catastrophically. These highly sophisticated battle computers had been refined over centuries of flawlessly conquering static, predictable empires. They were fundamentally programmed to assume that any rational enemy commander would logically prioritize the preservation of their expensive capital ships and the fragile lives of their crews. The choir engineers, however, operated on a completely alien, terrifying paradigm. They willingly sacrificed heavy iron and mortal flesh, not out of panic or poor planning, but to absolutely dictate the overall tempo of adaptation. The humans prioritized the immediate acquisition of combat telemetry over simple, individual survival. It was a ferocious, invisible evolutionary pace that completely broke the Heliox predictive models, turning their pristine tactical readouts into a chaotic mess of incorrect assumptions and fatal, costly errors. Standing completely rigid on the heavily armored bridge of his massive flagship, Commander Rayler watched his absolute certainties slowly crumble into burning ash before his eyes. He commanded his forces with brutal precision, executing textbook flanking maneuvers that successfully crushed isolated pockets of human resistance. Yet, every single time he secured a localized, seemingly decisive victory, That exact same tactical advantage miraculously morphed into a lethal, inescapable trap just a few hours later. The human fleet was actively learning his mind. He slowly realized, with a heavy, suffocating knot of pure dread forming in his stomach, that he was no longer fighting a standard, carbon-based military hierarchy. He was actively battling a massive, hyper-intelligent ecosystem that was actively thinking, bleeding, and rapidly evolving through a perfectly synchronized network of shattered ships, resilient people, a deeply bruised ocean, and a chorus of singing moons. Far away from the silent explosions in the vacuum of space, deep beneath the raging surface of Meridian, former archivist Sarah Knoll stood perfectly still inside the damp, heavily fortified command bunker. She stood quietly beside the lead human diplomat, Dorian Strake, bathed in the cold, blue light of a massive holographic tactical map projecting the brutal geometry of the slaughter happening in the glass shoals. Watching the complex, shifting ballet of sacrifice and rapid adaptation unfolding on the screen, Sarah finally grasped the terrifying truth hidden so deeply within the forbidden historical texts she had smuggled away. Humanity did not calculate warfare by asking the simple, mortal question of whether they would achieve victory. That was a small, fragile concept meant for lesser species. When the ancient collective went to war, they only asked themselves exactly how much time they required to turn the current conflict into a highly specific ecosystem that they fundamentally understood vastly better than their arrogant opponent. Back aboard the Heliox flagship, Science Officer Nemi Quor stared blankly at the cascading streams of raw combat data pouring endlessly into her terminal. Her breath caught painfully in her throat, her hands trembling violently against the smooth glass of the console as a horrifying, absolute truth finally crystallized in her brilliant mind. The Ascendancy was technically winning the initial firefights. They were successfully destroying crewed human ships and ending human lives by the thousands. But every single casualty they proudly inflicted was an apocalyptic mistake. With every single shattered Meridian hull, and with every desperate human tactical maneuver they arrogantly countered, the Heliox fleet was inadvertently feeding the enemy collective. They were unwittingly, perfectly teaching the waking biosphere exactly how to dissect, dismantle, and entirely consume the Heliox war machine down to its very fundamental essence. The brutal engagement within the swirling dust of the debris fields reached a sudden, completely unexpected breaking point. A massive segment of the Meridian defensive line abruptly shattered. It was not a calculated, orderly tactical withdrawal. It appeared to be a frantic, terrified collapse. The human vessels broke their tightly woven resonance formations, spilling chaotic, highly disorganized distress signals across every open frequency. They turned their blunt, scarred prows away from the blinding plasma fire and fled desperately toward the cold, looming shadows of the 7 dead moons. To the highly trained, rigidly disciplined tacticians observing from the pristine decks of the Heliox Armada, this frantic exodus looked exactly like a total psychological rout. Joy, fierce and deeply arrogant, instantly swept through the Ascendancy command channels. The alien fleet commanders, completely intoxicated by the sheer volume of their apparent victory, eagerly broke their own strict defensive formations to pursue the fleeing prey. They firmly believed they had finally touched the absolute psychological breaking point of the primitive human mind. They were completely certain that the terrible pressure of overwhelming numerical superiority had finally cracked the fragile resolve of the ocean dwellers. It was the exact same, fatal, prideful mistake that every single ancient, forgotten civilization had made millennia ago when fighting the choir engineers. They mistook a deliberate drawing back of the bowstring for the snapping of the weapon. The frantic human retreat was not a surrender. It was a perfectly synchronized, incredibly complex winding of a cosmic mechanism. The moment the vanguard of the Heliox pursuit force crossed the invisible threshold into the lunar orbit, the trap violently snapped shut. The human navigators, utilizing the raw, newly awakened mnemonic codes flooding their minds, sent a highly concentrated, specialized burst of deep resonance directly into the rocky mantle of the 7 warning moons. The ancient, dormant satellites did not simply echo the signal. They violently woke up. The 7 massive celestial bodies instantly transformed from silent observers into a colossal, overlapping grid of resonance jamming and localized spatial distortion. They became a system-wide artillery field that absolutely no one in the Heliox military possessed the theoretical physics to counter or even comprehend. In a matter of seconds, the suffocating tide of the battle completely and violently reversed. The advanced optical sensors of the Ascendancy cruisers were violently thrown completely out of phase, projecting wildly inaccurate, ghostly duplicates of enemy ships across their tactical screens. Their pristine, mathematically perfect energy shields began to pulse and misfire in a chaotic, broken rhythm. Blind, disoriented, and completely panicked. The Heliox fleet formations collapsed into utter, lethal chaos. Alien gunners, completely unable to trust their own heavily compromised targeting computers, began firing blindly into the dark, violently tearing into the armored hulls of their own allied vessels. And from the deep, pitch-black shadows of the lunar craters, the Meridian fleet surged forward. They did not fly like a scattered, terrified mob. They moved with terrifying, absolute precision, striking from the darkness exactly as if they had been patiently waiting in those exact spatial coordinates, since long before the battle had even officially begun. In the very heart of the chaotic slaughter, the incredibly ugly, heavily scarred freighter commanded by Ivy Roan and her crew moved like a brutal apex predator. Rhett Kanan sat at his primary targeting console, his hands moving with the fluid, deadly grace of a master weaver. The engineers aboard the vessel had not simply installed the pristine Heliox shielding matrix they captured during their very first skirmish. They had completely inverted its quantum polarity. When the massive alien dreadnoughts desperately focused their heavy plasma batteries on the charging human ship, Rhett activated the altered shield. It did not deflect the incoming fire. It forcefully caught the superheated plasma, trapped it within a rapidly expanding resonance echo chamber, and violently reflected the concentrated energy directly back at the source. The devastating Heliox firepower violently bloomed deep inside their own localized defensive bubbles, instantly vaporizing thick armor plating and completely gutting massive cruisers from the inside out in brilliant, silent flashes of catastrophic structural failure. High above the slaughter, standing paralyzed on his pristine command deck, Commander Rayler Kev felt the icy grip of pure terror finally seize his chest. His absolute certainties were burning to ash. His overwhelming, godlike armada was actively tearing itself apart in the dark. In a moment of sheer, breathless panic, he chose a highly desperate, incredibly risky countermeasure. He forcefully detached an elite spearhead consisting of 12 heavily armed, heavily shielded Vanguard destroyers from the crumbling main engagement. He ordered them to bypass the lunar trap entirely, execute a wide flanking maneuver, and strike directly at the heart of Meridian. His frantic, desperate goal was to violently bombard the massive, vulnerable anchor cities floating on the ocean surface, hoping to force the human fleet to abandon their devastating lunar ambush and turn back to protect their fragile homeworld. The 12 elite destroyers burned their engines to absolute maximum capacity, tearing a blazing trail through the cold vacuum toward the bruised blue planet. They prepared to rain absolute destruction upon what they believed was a helpless civilian population. But as they violently breached the dense, swirling cloud cover and descended into low orbit, the alien commanders looked down and realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that Meridian was no longer a soft, vulnerable target. It was not a planet of simple fishermen and fragile floating habitats anymore. The entire, sprawling global ocean had been miraculously and violently transformed into a staggering, multi-layered fortress of pure destruction. Vast, artificial orbital coral reefs forged from highly conductive memory iron completely blocked their descent paths. Massive, planetary-scale tidal cannons, powered directly by the kinetic fury of the deep ocean currents, locked onto their thermal signatures the exact second they breached the atmosphere. The beautiful, glowing silver auroras they had witnessed months ago were now revealed to be dense, highly lethal nets of weaponized electromagnetic phasing. Beneath the churning, violent surface of the dark water, thousands of heavily fortified, fully submerged missile silos simultaneously ignited. The elite Heliox spearhead did not even have the necessary time to arm their primary weapons or broadcast a single scream for help. The 12 highly advanced warships were systematically and completely erased from existence in just a few short minutes. They were violently pulled from the sky and crushed into burning debris. Not because the people of Meridian possessed some mystical, omnipotent magic, but because for the past 2 entire years, humanity had worked tirelessly, relentlessly, and with absolute, unified purpose. They had taken every single ounce of their industrial grit, combined it with the terrible, waking memories of their ancient ancestors, and meticulously forged the very world they lived upon into an unimaginably massive, lethal instrument of total war. Watching the completely silent, localized telemetry feeds of his 12 elite ships winking out of existence one by one, Commander Rayler Kev finally collapsed heavily into his command chair. The pristine white walls of his bridge felt incredibly small and suffocatingly tight. He finally, truly understood the profound, heavy meaning behind the ancient warning broadcast by the dead moons. The most dangerous, terrifying aspect of humanity was never the dormant, godlike power they had willingly buried in the dark trenches. The absolute, existential threat they posed to the entire universe was the terrifying, incomprehensible speed at which they became vastly superior the very second someone arrogantly forced them to fight for their lives. The crushing defeat in the orbital space above the blue world left the Ascendancy fleet in complete tatters. The once invincible armada was now a fractured, bleeding collection of heavily damaged vessels, limping aimlessly through the dark void. Commander Rayler sat in his dimly lit quarters, the pristine white walls, now scorched black and flickering with failing auxiliary power. He stared at the casualty reports continuously flooding his terminal, feeling the profound weight of 1,000 dying ships pressing down on his chest. He finally bypassed the official, heavily monitored military channels and established a highly encrypted, direct communication line to the Supreme Council on his distant homeworld. His voice carried absolutely no pride, no grand military posturing, and no promises of eventual victory. It carried only the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute reality. Negotiate before there is nothing left to win, he transmitted into the silence of space. Light years away, in the grand, echoing chambers of the capital, the arrogant young political faction fiercely resisted the cold truth of their impending doom. They loudly clamored for the immediate authorization of a forbidden, highly unstable, ancient anti-resonance weapon, eagerly willing to crack the ocean planet entirely, rather than admit a humiliating defeat to a primitive species. Their desperate, bloodthirsty shouting was instantly silenced when the Elder Archive unilaterally bypassed all governmental firewalls and broadcasted a newly compiled strategic simulation across every single secure terminal in the Ministry. The primeval artificial intelligence had continuously analyzed the exact, terrifying rate of human adaptation during the recent battle. The resulting projection was a cold, mathematically perfect death sentence. If the conflict continued for another 18 months, the entire economic foundation, logistical supply chains, and military command hierarchy of the Empire would systematically and irreversibly implode. The humans had not just learned how to fight them. They had fundamentally reverse-engineered the entire societal structure of their enemy and were preparing to dismantle it, piece by piece. Aboard the surviving flagship, several high-ranking tactical officers, completely blinded by their wounded pride and a desperate need for vengeance, attempted to manually override their commander. They initiated the launch sequence for a final, devastating plasma bombardment against the civilian floating cities below. Science Officer Nemi acted with desperate, completely silent resolve. She swiftly accessed the primary fire control mainframes and permanently locked out their command authorization chains using an archaic encryption key she had deciphered from the ancient texts. She stood completely calm as the furious officers drew their sidearms and placed her under immediate arrest for high treason against the Empire. She accepted the heavy metal restraints without speaking a single word of protest. She knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that sacrificing her own life and her entire career was the only physical way to prevent the war from sliding past the point of absolute, unrecoverable ruin. Down on the turbulent surface of the planet, the former archivist Sarah utilized her unique position and her deep knowledge of both cultures to broker a highly fragile, incredibly tense, temporary ceasefire corridor. Her primary goal was the mutual, unarmed exchange of the thousands of severely wounded combatants currently floating in the freezing wreckage of the upper atmosphere. During this quiet, heavy transfer, heavily armed alien infantrymen cautiously boarded the rusted medical barges of the ocean dwellers. They fully expected brutality, harsh interrogation, or at the very least, cold, mocking indifference. Instead, they watched in profound, silent shock as human medics, their faces utterly exhausted and stained with grease and salt, meticulously treated the terrible plasma burns of the very soldiers who had just tried to incinerate their homes. This quiet, unceremonious display of profound mercy sent a psychological shockwave through the surviving alien ranks that proved vastly more devastating than any kinetic weapon ever could. The core military doctrine of the Ascendancy dictated that a superior, victorious force should ruthlessly and completely crush its broken enemy to ensure permanent submission. To witness the newly awakened, terrifyingly capable humans actively refusing to be swallowed entirely by their own justified wrath shook the fundamental worldview of the alien empire to its very core. It made the human race infinitely more terrifying than the dusty, forbidden historical records had ever managed to describe. A monster driven strictly by blind rage could eventually be outsmarted, trapped, or simply exhausted. A vastly superior predator that possessed the absolute, terrifying discipline to choose exactly when to sheath its claws was a force of nature that simply could not be conquered by force of arms. From the deeply submerged command bunker, Dorian transmitted his formal response to the desperate plea for a truce. His voice echoed across the quieted battlefields, smooth, exhausted, but completely unyielding. He formally agreed to halt all aggressive resonance strikes and immediately open diplomatic channels. However, he laid down an absolute, non-negotiable foundation for the upcoming peace talks. Humanity would never again accept any form of glorified containment, nor would they tolerate being constantly monitored and restricted like dangerous animals kept in a cosmic cage. They were stepping out into the wider galaxy completely on their own terms, as an independent and sovereign power, or they would simply continue the bloody slaughter until the stars themselves burned out. Rhett walked slowly through the sterile, painfully bright corridors of a newly established orbital hospital hovering in the thin upper atmosphere. He looked through the thick, reinforced glass windows into the incredibly crowded medical bays. Hundreds of alien soldiers lay in the narrow cots, their arrogant pride and imposing military bearing completely stripped away by agonizing pain and absolute, undeniable defeat. He stopped and stared quietly at a young alien pilot whose hands were heavily bandaged, shivering uncontrollably under a thin thermal blanket. Standing there, Rhett finally understood the profound gravity of their long struggle. The ultimate victory was never going to be found in turning the enemy homeworld into glowing glass or drowning their massive fleets in rivers of blood. The greatest, most enduring triumph was forcing an arrogant, unyielding empire to fundamentally recognize the severe, fatal limits of its own destructive hubris. As the massive railguns and plasma batteries finally fell silent across the system, a deeply classified, terrifying secret remained tightly locked within the minds of the human council. Through the vast, interconnected web of their restored collective memory and their absolute mastery of localized resonance, the Choir engineers had successfully mapped the core navigational matrix of the entire enemy empire. At any point during the last 48 hours of the brutal engagement, humanity could have initiated a massive, system-wide disruption strike that would have permanently and completely crippled the central navigation network of their enemy. They could have easily stranded tens of thousands of alien ships in the dark void to slowly suffocate and starve. They deliberately chose to hold that devastating blade back. They withheld the lethal blow because they fundamentally desired to enter the galactic stage as a strong, reasonable partner, rather than a permanent, unforgivable curse that would be hunted for eternity. The heavy door to the final chapter of the conflict slowly opened when both weary sides finally agreed upon a completely secure, highly isolated neutral location for the summit. They selected a silent, abandoned orbital mining station, slowly circling a dying dwarf star, located exactly halfway between their respective, heavily fortified territories. It was a cold, incredibly desolate place, perfectly suited for the incredibly heavy, somber burden of ending a terrible war. And as the human delegation finalized their incredibly short list of non-negotiable demands, they made one highly specific request regarding the opposing diplomatic team. Commander Raylor was summoned by his full name. He was strictly demanded to attend the peace talks not as a conquering hero, nor as a brilliant tactician, but specifically as the primary, living witness to the very first, catastrophic mistake that had awoken the sleeping giants. The Heliox delegation arrived at the neutral orbital station with a staggering procession of over 200 high-ranking diplomats, military adjudicators, and legal scribes. They marched into the grand, cold meeting chamber, wearing immaculate, heavily decorated uniforms that projected the absolute authority of a galactic empire. They brought with them a physical treaty that was remarkably thick, a massive document overflowing with arrogant demands and intricate legal bindings. It detailed strict flight path restrictions for human vessels, absolute armament ceilings for the planetary defense grid, sprawling no-fly zones across adjacent star systems, and a highly rigorous, humiliating schedule for the external oversight of human technological development. It was not a treaty of peace. It was a highly sanitized instrument of absolute surrender, designed to gracefully chain a beast they could not kill. Against this overwhelming tide of imperial bureaucracy, the heavy blast doors on the opposite side of the chamber slid open to reveal exactly 3 individuals representing the Meridian Council. Dorian Strake walked in first, his weathered face calm and his posture completely relaxed, wearing the simple, dark coat of a planetary administrator. Nemi Quor walked closely beside him, attending not as a prisoner of war, but serving officially as an objective observer who had willingly crossed the dividing line to stand with the ocean dwellers. Rhett Kanan brought up the rear, wearing a clean but clearly worn heavy canvas jacket. He was not a politician, a general, or a brilliant scientist. He was there acting as the sole representative for the fiercely ordinary citizens of Meridian, a simple man who had intimately witnessed every single terrifying step of his own world waking up. Dorian did not raise his voice as he approached the massive central table. He did not point fingers, nor did he issue grand, theatrical threats of total annihilation. He simply reached into his coat pocket and placed a small, perfectly transparent data sphere gently onto the polished metal surface. The sphere hummed quietly and immediately projected 2 highly detailed, planetary-scale holographic simulations into the cold air between the opposing factions. The first projection showed the mathematically inevitable future if the current war continued. It did not depict a swift, glorious human victory, but rather a slow, agonizing Heliox defeat. It showed the vast, interconnected imperial economy bleeding out over decades, the rigid military command structures completely collapsing under the weight of human adaptation, and the surrounding galaxy catching fire as desperate ascendancy warlords violently turned on one another. The second projection shifted the light entirely. It showed a future forged through genuine, equitable cooperation. It illustrated how the deeply misunderstood human resonance technology could easily be adapted to heal the galaxy. It displayed dying, arid worlds, suddenly flourishing with engineered water cycles. Isolated colonies instantly reconnected through quantum acoustic webs, and heavily depleted planets miraculously stabilized by deep core harmonics. Dorian then calmly and systematically verbally rejected every single restrictive clause within the massive Heliox Treaty. He dismantled their demands line by line, his voice remaining so profoundly calm and even that the ambient air in the chamber grew incredibly heavy with tension. He spoke without an ounce of anger or desperation. The supreme alien diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging incredibly nervous glances, because absolutely everyone in the Grand Room deeply understood the chilling reality of the situation. The man standing before them was actively negotiating from a position of absolute, godlike power. He possessed the complete capacity to utterly destroy them, yet he was consciously, deliberately choosing not to. The most profound, terrifying shift in the entire negotiation occurred when Dorian leaned forward and revealed the deepest secret of the Meridian defense. He explained that humanity had only restored a small, highly restricted fraction of their ancient collective memory, purely for the sake of immediate planetary self-defense. If they willingly chose to completely open what the ancient texts referred to as the chorus state, they possessed the absolute capability to reach across the dark void and completely infiltrate the strategic command systems of the entire Heliox Empire on a galactic scale. They could easily introduce a cascading, microscopic rhythmic delay into every single alien computer network, effectively causing the sprawling empire to completely paralyze itself within a matter of weeks. But they steadfastly refused to take that final, devastating step. Dorian looked directly into the eyes of the supreme alien diplomats and stated clearly that a civilization that does not know how to stay its hand is still sleepwalking in its own power. The heavy silence that followed that terrifying revelation was finally broken by a single, deliberate movement. Commander Raylor Kev, the man who had ordered the very first strike, slowly stood up from his seat in the middle of the crowded Heliox delegation. He looked across the table at the three humans, and then he turned to face his own highest authorities. He confessed openly and loudly that he had arrogantly flown right past the ancient warning broadcast by the dead moons. He admitted that he had forcefully ordered the extraction of the memory anchor out of pure greed. He acknowledged, completely stripping away his own imposing military dignity, that he had willfully awakened a sleeping giant that he fundamentally lacked the intellectual capacity to understand. That stark, honest admission of profound failure completely shattered the last remaining bit of arrogant pride within the Heliox ranks. The final terms that were ultimately ratified mere hours later resembled absolutely nothing found in the original, dictatorial treaty. It was not a surrender agreement, but a binding pact of absolute, equal standing. It guaranteed unrestricted expansion rights for the human race across the stars. It established a firm commitment to mutual military defense against any outside aggressors. It outlined a highly controlled, reciprocal scientific exchange program to benefit both vastly different civilizations. And finally, it decreed the joint, cooperative management of the 7 warning moons, ensuring they would be preserved forever, not as a terrifying weapon, but as a shared, sacred galactic heritage site. In the peaceful aftermath of the monumental summit, Nemi Quor officially became the very first scientific liaison permanently stationed between the two formerly warring empires, dedicating her brilliant mind to bridging the vast technological gap. Sarah Knoll chose to permanently remain on the bruised blue planet, acting as a living, breathing bridge between the dusty, forgotten files of the ancient past and the bright, unwritten future of her new home. Rhett Kanan did not accept any grand military commissions, lucrative government positions, or fancy political titles. He simply boarded a standard commercial transport back to his rainy, turbulent home. He returned to the rusted, salt-stained docks of the Rust Basin, because the man who had actively helped turn the tide of the greatest conflict in the universe still had an old, weather-beaten trawler that desperately needed fixing, and heavy synthetic nets that needed mending before the next storm rolled in. Deep within the subterranean, heavily shielded vaults of the Heliox capital world, the primeval artificial intelligence known as the Elder Archive quietly updated its most ancient, restricted files. It officially removed the planetary blockade status from the Meridian system. It carefully entered the final, permanent classification for the human race into the permanent galactic registry. Apex civilization level corrective force, diplomatic standing ally. And then, acting entirely on its own accord, the ancient machine appended a final, unencrypted note intended for any future empire that might one day encounter the hardened children of the sea. Congratulations. You have awakened the most dangerous creature in the universe. Luckily for you, this time it chose to reach out a hand first. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below to let us know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.